Outa-space, because artists lack the time, resources, and places to make creative work. Outa-space, because the street, the squares, and all the common places we mix in are where we need to decide our future. Outa-space, because we need to take our minds above the clouds to look down on our planet, to dream, to wonder, but also to see everything in the context of everything else. Hi, I am RobbieBot, your in-flight community communication device. We hope you have a pleasant experience with us today. You can leave an optional tip in the links below. Art must be free, but the rent is not, so all support is welcome. Mixing Pop and Politics, an interview with Toby Manning.
Okay, so hello, Toby Manning, are you with us?
Hello, good to be here.
Hey, Toby, thanks for joining the podcasts. And today we're going to talk about your book, Mixing Pop and Politics, a Marxist History of Popular Music, which is a perfect fit for this podcast. But before we do that, I just want to know a little bit about you. We've only met 5 minutes ago. I'd really like to know who you are as a person, what you do, what's your history, just a little bit about yourself.
Okay, well, I'm a writer based in London. Of course, writer always means that you have to do numerous other things to actually earn proper money. So I teach, and I've worked as a musician myself as well. But broadly speaking, the relevant thing is that for a long time I was a music journalist back in the 90s and noughties. When music journalism was still a thing, when there were still music magazines, when the record companies and the magazines had more money. So I got sent all over the world, which was really good fun. But I was aware even at the time that we were just a sort of wing of the promotional industry. We were paid by the record companies to go to far-flung places like Tokyo and stuff. But the thing was that as journalists, we were sort of trained by our editors to only write about music in terms of sort of biography and in terms of what other music it sounded like. So, and I didn't think anything of that, because I think that's how society as a whole probably trains us to think about music, that it isn't really anything to do with culture or society at large, unless it's, very explicitly a protest song, So whether it's, I don't know, Masters of War by Bob Dylan, or Between the Wars by Billy Bragg, you know where you are, that's a protest song, that's political. Everything else is, is not really, it's not really got much to do with anything.
Okay, so I mean, you came to, let's say, this book as a process of waking up in your life and realizing what your job was and where things were going. I mean, for me, when I looked at the book, I started to read it. I was like, wow, there's a lot of different, every song he's talking about there, well, not everyone, but most of them, they started to play in my head. And I said, oh yeah, I know that one. Oh yeah, I know that one. And I was thinking, when I wrote on my Facebook group that we were going to do an interview with you, I said, I wished I had a vinyl version of this book, because actually the song list, the mixtape, to use an old term, would be quite something. I mean, it's a real delve into so many different genres and types. But for me, I would have gone pop music. That's just the shit I don't like, isn't it? So it was quite interesting. I mean, my history, just to give you a little bit of background on myself. Now I'm a multidisciplinary artist. I do mostly sculpture. But when I was younger, I was a drummer in a band for about 15 years and was trying to make it and put a lot of time and love into that. And music was everything. It was my voice, but also I was super politically active. So at 16, I volunteered. You mentioned it in the book a little bit. You mentioned Red Wedge. And I volunteered for them. So my trajectory, I didn't stay there long. My trajectory was a political activist and a musician. And I didn't put the two together either, that they were the same. It wasn't until probably about 10 years ago with the sculpture work that I've been doing, I realized my politics and my art are the same thing. So is this that's kind of how you introduce yourself, that you were a writer and you were writing, what did you say, biographies, and this music's a bit like this music, and maybe That wasn't enough? Is that what you're saying?
It just gradually came upon me that, it's amazing to me. Like you say, so many people would argue something like Red Wedge. That's an instance of like, here's obviously politics and popular music, imbricated. But, even you didn't fully get the connection there. And I totally understand that, because there's so much sense that music is just sort of entertainment. It's you have a personal relationship, perhaps, rather than the political relationship with music. And I think, it was just a process. I just started to notice more and more what songs were kind of saying. And that didn't have to be through the lyrics. That could be through the music or the tone or something like that. I think there was a particular thing that stopped me in my tracks, which was an article by Grail Marcus, that's in the Fascist Bathroom collection. And it's just about Laurie Anderson's Oh Superman, which was, a sort of novelty, huge, unexpected hit in Britain in about 1980 or something. And, and I'd never thought of it as anything that this sort of slightly strange novelty, but he went into this whole thing about it being an exposition of the sort of military industrial complex and its whole impact on our personal lives and the way it infests our everyday appliances and gadgets and stuff, and our personal relations. I'm like, oh, okay.
Yeah, it's strange, isn't it? I mean, I found now that I'm slightly older, we have things like Spotify, and I listen to era music. So I listen to music from when I was really into it, and I find that I've got a bit stuck, and I find that I like the stuff I used to think was really shit at the time. And this is an interesting thing. Then maybe we'll broaden this out later. But how the aesthetics of music and how the actual meaning behind lyrics and poetry, how they interact. So you can listen to something and start dancing. I got loads of friends that say, "Oh, come on, let's dance." When I was younger, and I said, "This music's really cool," and I was like, "No, I don't dance to that." I was a bit sort of rigid in one respect, but I was also really like, "No, what's that saying to me? It's not really getting my emotion. It's not got, And so what you're talking about there is like analyzing music.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something that most people don't analyze music. Most people feel it, right? And so it was very important to me to try and find a way of talking about music that didn't make it a purely intellectual phenomenon, because it's not even for me and for you, right? So it's just like, there is an emotion. That one of the part of the power of popular music is that it's like it's one of the most effective emotional communicators. It sort of bypasses. It can express what the artist wants to say, but it also invokes a similar feeling or another feeling in the listener as well. So yeah, I didn't want to miss out that sort of passion, because that's really important, that emotional aspect. But I wanted to understand those emotions perhaps less personally and more politically, as what I call it, derived from Raymond Williams, structures of feeling. So that there are these sort of currents, for want of a better word, in a particular time in society where a lot of people are feeling the same things at once. And the pop charts are a wonderful way of recording that, because that's a record of what public opinion, as it were, is. It's rather different to a political poll. These particular songs struck a chord with people. And then my question started to be, why? For what reason? And what was the chord? What were they saying? What were people responding to? And what's interesting about what you're saying, about people getting stuck in an era, you can see that in a very personal way. That's just like, you're revisiting your youth or whatever. That was a good time in your life or something. But also, one of the things, the way I structured the book was very much that I started to discern that there were quite coherent eras within music. And so I think when you revisit an era, you're revisiting like a particular structure of feeling, a whole series of very, very specific emotions and attitudes are being coalesced in that music. And like you say, it's very interesting that goes across any tribal division as well. Obviously there are different views being expressed, but I think that's the reason that when we go back to an era, we often find that we actually like the stuff that we didn't like then, because it's still of that era. I think it's still expressing things that is very evocative of that time and that place and those attitudes and those events and ideas.
So what we're saying here is there's numerous levels and layers. There's the individual, their personal situation, how they felt the music at the time. There's the era, how that music was affected by wider society. There's talking about the emotions of the beat and the patterns of the music, which is a whole subject, so I'm going to do another podcast in the near future about sound, and how that emotionally affects us, the lyrics. So all these, there's so many different ways. It's like, and when I was reading the book, I was like, yeah, that song. And now when I'm listening, while I'm working away on my sculptures, I listen to a lot of music. I'm thinking, what did Bowie mean? What was he saying? And now you got me going, because before, although I've always orientated towards the importance of what a song means, I'm actually analyzing it more. So within this book, with all that going on, how have you mapped it out? What's the route you've taken?
Okay, I suppose I've mapped it out from the mid 50s to now, which to me does two things. One, it sort of depicts a coherent time in culture. That's recognizably some relative of the world that we live in now, or the formation of the world we live in now. I think the sort of pre-war period seems prehistoric somehow, but we can relate to stuff from any time from the sort of 50s onwards. But I think also the reason, so this is the thing, I see everything is interrelated in this way. So culture is always going to sort of somehow reflect politics. That what's happening there is there's a particular political narrative that sort of describes. So I'm telling the story of sort of post-war history from then till now through music. And what you're getting there, therefore, is the establishment of a sort of society that attempted to temper the sort of red-toothed aspects of capitalism for a while in the post-war period. And I call that Fordism. So that's derived from Henry Ford's sort of system earlier in the century, whereby he hit upon. I mean, don't get me wrong. Henry Ford was essentially a fascist, so he's no kind of a progressive figure, except that it's interesting that in his factories he hit upon the novel idea that if he treated his workers decently and gave them certain rights and representation, they might be less likely to rebel and thus would be better workers. So this idea was essentially taken up by governments and sort of infused the whole of society. It's in the New Deal in America, and then it's the sort of the post-war Labour government, and what we might. So I mean, Fordism is we might call welfare capitalism, we might call social democracy. It's trying to create a sort of fairer version of capitalism that doesn't involve basically revolution and lopping the heads off the capitalists and the establishment.
Okay, interesting. So you've sort that's how you've charted it out. I mean, you go from the 50s specifically, which is an interesting starting point up to today. But also it's about the USA and the UK. Or the English language direction, although everywhere is interrelated. Obviously, there's a whole world of musical things going on there. But for such a massive subject, these are the places that you've honed in on. Would that be about correct?
Yeah, so I've basically, it's basically a study of what some might call Anglophone popular music, because I regard the British and American sort of post-war experience politically and culturally as being incredibly, having incredible commonality. We're locked into each other in a way that other places don't have as much. So there's a sort of and it's two-way as well. It's not just a matter of the fact that we copied America, which we did incessantly, but the British invasion and stuff like that, so that goes the other way as well. So yeah, I only kind of outlined sort of part of the narrative. So you get that sort of post-war system that is then deliberately dismantled in the late 70s, and so by post-Fordism or neoliberalism, which then, which is what we've had ever since. So basically, we've got this. I've sort of the structure of the narrative is, this creation of a attempt to create a sort of fairer system that produces some pretty inspiring and amazing music that's expressive of those new freedoms, I would say. and then you get the sort of shift from the 80s onwards, with the sort of much more reactionary system, which hasn't really changed since. And what's interesting about that is that it doesn't just produce reactionary music, of course. It does produce more reactionary music, but there's still protest, because protest never goes away. There's still resistance, and there's still alternative ways of thinking.
Really interesting. I'm just going to hold you there for a second. Just draw back one step before I follow on from what you're saying. Pop music, popular music. Obviously, there's a connection with popular culture, which in all art forms took a leap forward after the war. But what exactly do you mean by popular music? Because when I read the book, I was like, oh yeah, I like that one. Oh yeah, I like that one. Okay, yeah, that's good. Oh yeah, I didn't like that much, but most of the stuff I had a connection with. In my heart, I hate pop music. I like, I know, indie, or I like reggae, or I like whatever. But just to define before we get into anything else, what do you mean by pop music exactly?
Yeah, well, I think it's got forgotten now, because pop music has become quite a specific genre. It always had the connotation that sort of the hip probably weren't very happy with, even back in the day. But it's just like, but now it's become very specific. It's, I don't know, Beyonce or Taylor Swift or whatever is pop. Whereas it just used to be short for popular, and it was everything. And so, broadly speaking, it probably encompassed things that weren't popular either. It was just the form of music that that followed in the wake of rock and roll, which was called pop. We wouldn't necessarily think of as pop now. So it's just an expression of popular culture, of pop culture, and Go on, give me another prompt before I try.
No, it's good. I just wanted to lay that out, because when I was reading it, I just kept looking at the, mixing pop. I hate pop. I just wanted you to clarify that a little bit. So the map you're drawing out there, that you've done a book that starts in the 50s. You go not decade by decade. The decades are often split into two. You build it around political events, which I really like. You sort of interject, this was taking place while this music was going on. It's really nicely layered. There's lots of referencing to different songs. And then you take it up to the present day, and around about the 80s, and I think around about Human League, everything seems to hinge and change, and then we turn towards, and it's really weird, because my relationship to Human League is quite interesting. I'll explain in a minute. But then we go into neoliberalism, we go into the period of history we're in now. So really we're talking about two halves, but you divide it all the way along in terms of radical, not so radical. This reflected this political development, this was going on in society, this was what's going on in music. The Human League thing, I think you have a little bit of a dig at Human League. I mean, in general, you don't talk about the aesthetics that much. Like you're saying, you depersonalize it. And I remember dancing to Human League, which is kind of the opposite of what I would dance to, and feeling I was being quite radical because I was dancing. And I was dancing not looking like a Human League type person. Anyway, this is right. Anyway, so the book that's the structure of the book, which I think is fascinating and a good way to lay it out. Why Marxism?
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. I mean, I think that, it's specifically "Don't You Want Me" by Human League that I'm talking about at that point. I don't spend a lot of time thinking about the intentionality of an artist, because I think it's the sort of the way that it communicates to an audience that's important. But I think that I'm not necessarily having a go at them. I think they're depicting some like a structure of feeling, a current in society that was real. And they were quite aware of that as well. I mean, Phil Oakey has said, people think it's a love song, but it's quite an ugly song about sort of aggressive power playing. So, he was actually entirely cognizant of what was going on in that song. It's not a pretty sentiment that's being described there. It's very much of its time.
Yeah, I remember really liking them for a short period, and then they put a video with them being basically twats on a yacht, and I went, okay, they're not for me. They alienated me away from what they were doing, but I think it was a really good hinge point of history. Anyway, so you lay all that out, and as I've said, that you layer in political events that are happening at the same time as the music is coming out. You're talking about the songs, you're talking about the meanings, you're talking about the political background to that and the interrelationship. Why? And the book is called A Marxist History of Popular Music. Why Marxism? Why use Marxism to, I don't know, underscore your analysis? And what do you see as Marxism, which is another question.
Yeah, I mean, what you're describing is like, I mean, I could have called it a political history of pop music, because what I was doing at every point as I was writing and researching, which was, and I kept thinking, this is not going to work at some point. This is not going to work. At some point, I'm going to trip up. Was I would look at what was happening in the world in the period that felt like it was like a sort of coherent period to me, and I would think, do any of these songs sound like they might have some, not necessarily, cognizant, like an unwitting relationship to what's going on? Can I connect these up? And the thing is, and it was amazing how often that happened, how often that just, it worked really, really well. And I just think once you're thinking like that, you're basically saying everything is political. And once you're saying that everything is suffused by politics, then you're thinking like a Marxist, and so, and there were various iterations of that, So Marx had this notion of of base and superstructure. So that would be like the idea that, the capitalist system has an economic base, which therefore sort of predicts or sort of creates a superstructure, a cultural superstructure, which expresses the ideology of that political system, i.e. capitalism. Now, that's often used in a very reductive way. And so, yeah, certainly that does explain why you get reactionary songs. That does explain why you get, I don't know, Gwen Guthrie's Ain't Nothing Going On But the Rent at the height of the 80s, sort of individualism and sort of financialization and competitiveness. And in a even more sort of aggressively individualistic period where you get a song like Nas's Hate Me Now. But the thing is that Marx himself said that ideology is an area where people become aware and fight it out. So it's a contested space. And that's something that particularly Antonio Gramsci sort of ran with, the idea that, that yeah, sure, capitalism wants to dominate everyone and everything, and it will give it a really good go. That's its sort of motor. But that's assuming that human beings have no agency and that they won't fight it every step of the way in some form or another. So that it's like the struggle that's really interesting to me within music, within society, within everything else.
Yeah, I mean, as a Marxist, I think it's a very good use, and also to understand how culture works in the superstructure and how it can actually affect the base as well, the interactions, the dialectical relationships. And as I read the book, I saw quite regularly you would counter individualism with collective behavior within the songs. I think you talked at one point about the idea of the individual singer and the band. I mean, you didn't specifically talk about it, I don't think, but it comes up at different times. And I'm thinking back to me now as an artist being, I mean, I do sculpture, which is a very individual thing. But actually I do participation sculptures. So I try and bring the band in, because from my youth, I was in the band, and the band represented, a group of people that stuck together through thick and thin, and this is the class, if you like, the class dynamic, that working class people have a collective attitude in general, and capitalism in general has an individualistic outlook. So I thought that was really interesting. But one of the things I caught on was how you used utopia, utopian. And maybe this is connected to the feeling part of music. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Absolutely, yeah. So, I mean, utopia has a bit of a bad rap within Marxism. A lot of people.
That's why I said it. I'm being a bit of a devil's advocate here.
That's fine. I think a lot of sort of old school and sort of hardcore Marxists would be very like, utopianism has no place in Marxism, and they would be quoting very specifically from Marx himself. I think actually, and particularly Engels, I think. But But there is actually a very long line of what I would say are utopian Marxists, which have a strong crossover with humanist Marxists, I would say. So the people I'm particularly interested in are, well, the person I suppose I'm particularly interested in is Herbert Marcuse, who I would regard as a utopian Marxist, whether or not he called himself that. Just because his focus is on, you know, and he's a Marxist, and he spends a lot of time quoting from, I suppose people would say, that's the younger Marx he's quoting from, you know, not the later, more economist Marx, but he's very much into what is the quality of the life we lead, and could it be better? How is the human condition affected by our conditions of work and our conditions of life? And to me, that's very important. And it also helps answer certain other questions, like, you know, a recurring thing these days is like, you know, because of all the resentment to boomers, it's like, you can get to the stage of like, what were they complaining about? You know, why were they trying to imagine a better world? They had everything, you know, in the 60s. And yet, song after song in the 60s is about, you know, the possibilities of a better world, you know, whether it's Louis Armstrong's What a Wonderful World, or, you know, All You Need Is Love, or whatever else. So I think that desire to create something better is really fundamental to Marxism, and it gives you something to aspire to that's more appealing and less austere than a lot of Marxism. You know, it's like, this isn't a vision of, you know, queuing around concrete blocks, you know, while the sort of snipers, you know, overlook you from above. This is a vision of like a life of sort of fulfillment and, you know, and pleasure to a certain extent, rather than endless work and strife. And the thing is about this is that music's really good at that, you know, because music isn't a theoretical or a medium. You know, it's not an economist, you know, driven medium, but it is really good at imagining and envisaging and depicting utopias.
I think it's really interesting that you raised it, and I put it there because I was thinking, shall I talk to him about the Frankfurt School versus vulgar Marxism towards revolutionary parties? Should we go there? And I thought, no, we won't go there, but I think it needs drawing out. And I think for me, there is, I can't remember the actual line you used, but I think it was really, really well put, even though I can't remember the line. But it was more or less that music isn't the program. You know, music is the feeling for the movement.
Yeah.
And I think using utopia in that way, basically the dream of the future, which is what utopian is. I think it's from Plato or something, isn't it? Utopia, something like that. I can't remember exactly. Anyway, the point is, I think when you're talking about arts and these kind of things, I think there are criticisms we can make of the Frankfurt School of Thoughts and all these people, but when we're talking about art, they've done the work. You know, for at least to be delving into to try and draw these things out. The other word that comes quite often is the word alienation, which is very central. Again, it would be the young Marx, because he didn't really write detail about alienation, but alienation is more accepted across all forms of Marxism. And I found that one particularly interesting. How alienation and utopia, they sort of clash. I mean, I'm talking a bit here about the dialectics of how music actually functions in our head and in society. Do you have any sort of on the question of alienation?
Almost like the sort of, you know, I'm sort of resisting saying that they're kind of opposites, but they're obviously in a relationship to each other, aren't they? So it's like, you know, our lives, you know, based on alienated labor, are sort of fundamentally alienated. We're alienated from nature increasingly. We are alienated from each other in an increasingly sort of atomized, individualistic society. And we're often alienated from ourselves because we're, you know, either not in touch with what our true feelings or desires are, or just unable to realize them. So seems to me that then that utopianism is an attempt to address that and to try and, you know, access all those things, or you know, and yeah, it's vague, and yeah, it's unspecific, and yes, it's not a political program, but there's something, you know, I mean, there are obviously examples, like something like John Lennon's Imagine is much mocked for that kind of reason. But actually, going back to it, I was like, oh, actually, this is really quite inspiring. It's quite a radical vision. And
Mm.
I don't know, I mean, that I guess would be regarded as political, but in a vague way. But I mean, just, I don't know, the staple singers, I'll take you there. It's just like, quite a dismal time for sort of black politics. It's like having this, incredible vision of how things could be, which is just inspiring. And maybe you need that when things are hopeless. You need to be kind of like propelled to sort of, get up off the couch and sort of not sort of slip into despondency.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things you talk about, and I think most people say, yeah, the radical 60s, that's when, but there's a lot of inspirational stuff then, and I think me of the 80s, when I was a musician and was looking for inspiration, I didn't look around me. I looked back. I look back to this period, and we were listening to everything. And we'd listen to the old Grey Whistle Test, which was a 70s show, I think, and I was like 18 in 88, and so we were looking back towards these sort of songs that were talking about today. They were present for us. So I really get that sort of utopia versus alienation. I think the two, you're dead correct, they have a relationship, not necessarily as opposites. The other thing that you lace throughout all these histories, because for the listeners, obviously you've got to read the book to get the true feel, but you're talking about different political movements. You talk about Vietnam. You talk about the 60s. You talk about the crash in 2007. You talk about all these things, and you relate the music to those times. And you talk about class. You talk about class struggle, which is really important. We talked about Marxist analysis and all this kind of stuff and art. But you also, I think, regularly and really well bring in the question of, well, black music, black appropriation of music, but also the role that played. You talk about the feminist struggle within music at the same time. Could you elaborate a little bit on those points and why you had them continuously in the book?
Yeah, I suppose my argument would be that both radical ideas and radical or interesting or innovative music are going to arise probably from the margins. Certainly from the street up and from the margins, and that's going to be the working class, black or white or female, and so. And I just see these different iterations all the time of these sort of, homegrown eruptions of feeling and ideas and innovation occurring in these groups, and that's nearly always where it comes from. And particularly, there's almost no music that I covered in this period that didn't actually originate in black music, in black communities, and quite often black queer communities as well. So it's just like these marginal groups are really the sort of dynamic motor of musical creativity, I think.
Yeah, I think it's important as well because, I mean, today those things are recognized, but back in the day they weren't. Certainly
No.
weren't so in the 80s. Maybe
Right.
after that, maybe into this sort of more neoliberal period, and maybe in the 2000s, definitely noted, but not recognized really for the power. But I suppose you're talking a little bit there that people who are oppressed have to find a way of expressing that oppression.
Yeah.
And what comes from that is creativity, which for me is exactly what I believe in to be true. Most of my stuff is not created, most of the artwork I do is not created out of anger, but it's created out of frustration, of either being in a box or not being able to get forward or not being able to say my piece or belong or whatever the actual emotion might be. And I think music often does that. I think what's also, there's another little thread, it's not as deep as those other ones, but it does loop round. And I'm using these loops because this is how I dialectically think of Marxism. It works in cycles and connections and interconnections. Is the one where people sell out, or where those who were singing the song that we all sang, that collectively brought us together, go into the mainstream, become commodified by the capitalist machine. In the terms of the book, the new Fordist sort of machine brings them in, or the new liberalism, whichever one it was all about making money for capitalism. One had a slightly more social element to it, one was just nasty.
Yeah.
But you talk about, I think you mentioned, if I'm right, you talk about the Beatles, who were like the pinnacle of leading sort of, well, they didn't start out that way. They started out very boy band, didn't they? Become the pinnacle of, you know, of opposition music, and then sort of fade away into the wings, literally.
Well, at their moment, I have moments I'll insist, but yeah, it's true. I mean, like, the Beatles almost went the other way, didn't they? They went from, you know, being sort of almost company product to completely, doing, things that the record company would probably had no idea what on earth to do with. They just knew that by that stage they'd just let them get on with it, which is extraordinary that even happened. But how I see it, I mean, I don't tend to blame individuals too much. I'm sure there's the odd moment when I do, when people have let me down. The process of selling out. So, I talked about the sort of dynamism. There's two dynamisms at work here, and they're in opposition to each other, and it's a political opposition. So, there's the dynamism of capitalism, which essentially gobbles everything up and flattens it out and co-opts and contains it and removes its radicalism and removes its power, removes its collectivity, and turns its best into product. I'm not saying that any of that is necessarily particularly conscious. That's just how it works and how it does. And artists get caught up in that. But for me, that process of commodification and selling out, etc., and incorporation, it's often seen as like, oh, well, that's the problem. That's why there's nothing good or political or positive about popular music. A sort of Adorno line is just all going to be, it's sort of inculcated into the system. To me, that's actually quite inspiring, because to me, it's both an enactment, as it were, demonstration, and a metaphor for the class struggle, right? Because the other dynamism is you've got these things that erupt from the street up that nobody asked for, nobody wanted, nobody went looking for, that happen normally, against the knowledge of the industry and the establishment. It just erupts into the, and so capitalism has to then scramble to get on top of it, and then yes, eventually kind of contains and crushes it. But what happens then? It erupts again somewhere else in a different form. So to me, that's just a beautiful metaphor for those of us who might be inclined to be feeling despondent about politics, because actually music offers a really good example of how you can't ever crush the popular sort of energy and spirit. It will keep arising in new forms without anybody in the establishment say so, and they will never be able to crush it or contain it.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like, music's like volcanoes of music. The visual is what I had. And I think, the positive of that is that whatever they commodify will come up with something fresh, because we're human beings and we're under pressure, we're in a capitalist system, and the human spirit can be killed, literally sometimes.
Individuals and individual careers and movements and all the rest of it, and genres, all the rest of it can be killed off, but something else will crop up again to replace it. But I can be quite specific. There was a time when hip hop had been completely, defanged. By about 2010, everybody was singing, nobody was rapping. Even the sort of traditional hip hop beat had disappeared. It had gone all EDM. And then next thing you know, suddenly there's Kendrick Lamar and Childish Gambino. Just seemingly comes out of nowhere, that restates the sort of radicalism within what had felt like a dead genre.
I mean, I think in some ways, for artists in general, they have to respond to the day you're in. And in a sense, it's a bit like AI at the moment within visual artists. Like they're like, oh no, this is terrible, and it's almost like a Luddism developing. But actually, it's a tool that's there. We're here. This is what's happening. How do we respond? And the creativity, I think, is drawn from that. Okay, I mean, this is all. I mean, there's so much more in the book. There's so much more to say. We could spend hours talking about one period. We could have done a whole podcast on a period and just gone into that. We've tried to give it a broad thing. But I mean, it feels to me that you've got you're kind of critical of the left a little bit as you're going through the book. It's not super strong, but it's there. I mean, are you trying to draw out some message for people on the left to think about, or is there I'm not an alternative, not a motive specifically, but why do you think we need to understand this process? What will it help?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, I mean, there's numerous aspects to that. I suppose I think that, I mean, I think the left has tended to underappreciate the importance of popular culture for a start, and particularly music, you know, and think that it's somehow separate to politics. Whereas to me, it's something that infuses ordinary people's everyday lives to a degree that actual formal politics doesn't. So therefore, you know, underestimate it at your peril, as it were. So there's a sort of polemic about that, but I think there's also, yeah, I want there to be a point in going back. You know, I don't want it just to be about nostalgia and oh yes. Yeah. So I want it to be inspirational, hopefully. You know, that okay, yeah, we you know we can take inspiration from that, and we can try and recapture that sort of energy or feeling again. But also, yeah, learning from mistakes. And so I could be quite specific about that. I think that one of the reasons that the 60s movement, the countercultural movement founded, was a failure to unite all the disparate elements. And so, you know, a failure to properly bring in, I mean, the working class, that could be overstated, but you know, a tendency to be a bit of a kind of middle class movement. And there were some signs of those things uniting in the late 60s, early 70s, but they didn't do it enough, you know. So that for example. I also feel that, you know, in the late 70s, the left sort of, you know, gave in to the sort of neoliberal shift too readily, and eventually, you know, just sort of went along with it completely. So I mean, it depends who we're calling the left here, of course. The formal left had sort of, you know, given up the ghost some time before that.
No, I mean, it's very much a thing for me that I think artists need to orientate towards the workers' movement. The workers' movement need to orientate towards artists, and this mix has dynamite in it, because it can connect.
I mean, yeah, and you know, and the working, you say the working class, and people, you know, you don't even need to append white to it. Everyone thinks that you're talking about white people, but actually, the working class is, you know, is multi-ethnic. And if white workers, you know, unite with sort of black radical groups and stuff, you know, again, like you say, these people find the things that unite them, find their commonalities, and you know, there's loads more of us than there is of them. Ultimately, is the point, right?
And it's also,
we're often.
Sorry, I was just thinking about the recent anti-immigration demonstrations in the UK, and you know, ideas of things like rock against racism or popular music against racism might be a better use of the term, and these kind of things that they will respond, which kind of brings me to maybe try to conclude a bit, because where do you think popular music is going to go in connection with the class struggle? Because one of the things that's dawned on me while reading this book and working, mixing the two together, and I listen to a lot of music, is Spotify control everything I'm listening to. There's a whole different way of consuming music today. I think back to the band days, venues under crisis. I mean, I always think of something Zappa said, because you get all these things coming up in your Instagram feed these days, and I get a lot of Zappa for some reason. And he, you know, he was talking about how, yeah, they just let me do some music, man, and off I went, and you know, and then he did some crazy shit, and there was freedom. That doesn't exist in the same way. What does exist is we have a computer where I've got a program which I can write my own individualist song on it. So where do you see, you know, maybe just pop a little bit into the future, because you talked a lot about the past up to the present day. Where do you think things are going?
I don't know. So, I mean, I'm reluctant to sort of soothsay, but it seems to me that just as I feel that politically the way forward is for, you know, I've been saying this for some time in left-wing circles, and tumbleweed has blown through the room. I've been saying that, you know, the anti-fascist movement is something that we at the left have got to get much more involved with. We've got to ally with black groups and black communities, but also we probably got to do the heavy lifting there because they're the targets, you know. So I kind of feel that I found it so inspiring, those anti-fascist, anti-racist demonstrations that occurred a couple of months ago. And that also chimed to me with the experience I had canvassing for Jeremy Corbyn in Islington North this election. You know, just an incredibly diverse, multicultural area, you know, which with a lot of links between the groups, you know, and I feel that is the direction for both politics, is that you know, is particularly given that it's under threat. It's like, so we need to double down and say, no, actually, the utopian impulse is the multicultural impulse, is the celebration of a diverse society. But I think the same is probably true in music as well. So I think and it just so happens that just to illustrate this, that I went to a festival a couple of weeks ago and I was blown away by a band I'd never heard of called English Teacher, who you know, have a black singer and a white and a gang of white men in the band. And then a couple of weeks later, they win the Mercury Music Prize. So they have gone from, they come from nowhere. You know, they didn't come up with the say-so of anyone. You know, they have availed themselves of, like, you know, sort of the few remaining aspects of sort of cultural sort of largesse that exist in the UK. But you know, they've now kind of broken through into the mainstream, and I think we're probably, you know, I mean, mixed black and white artist groups are not, you know, hardly a new thing. I think we might see more of that kind of like crossover, and therefore a kind of mass up of different types of music, you know, sort of reflecting that sort of impulse, hopefully, that's sort of, you know, really alive now in society and politics.
Cool. Well, thanks a lot, Toby. I think the book's very inspiring. I think also it's full of positivity, which I think is, you know, confirmed by your finishing remarks. We'll put links in the links to how you can get the book in the comments or bio, whatever it's called, wherever you're listening to this podcast, because it's on YouTube and all the other things as well. Thanks very much for coming. I look forward. You got new plans, or are you going to sit on this? I mean, how long's the book been out? It's only been out 6 months, something like that.
A couple of months, and I'm still kind of, you know, doing the promotional round, as it were. At the moment, I've got quite a lot of events around the country, sort of coming up. But oh yeah, I have plans for a follow up, but I'm not rushing or diving.
Not going to reveal his artwork just at this stage. But okay, well, when you do that, we'll have you back. Thanks very much, and enjoy yourself. Enjoy your music, and thanks for coming on the show.
Very much. I've enjoyed it.
Okay, bye-bye now.
Cheers.
Okay, so welcome up to the space station, Tracy Edwards, a new person that's come up here for the first time. How you doing, Tracy?
Hi, Rob. Yeah, great. Yeah, it's great to be up here.
I don't know why you haven't been up in the space station yet, but I'm glad you finally made it. I hope the journey up wasn't too bad. So, first of all, because you're new to the podcast, for the listeners, who are you? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I am a Glaswegian living in London. Been living here for the past 18 years, and I'm a trade unionist. I was a trade union official for 17 years and a workplace rep in Glasgow for 10 years. So I'm a bit of a kind of political
Okay,
person,
you're a trade union activist kind
gobshite.
of. Okay, a gobshite, yeah, good. Well, the reason the reason why I specifically thought this was the space station for you is because you're the kind of friend that sends me a message at 2 a.m. in the morning after you've come back from a concert going, I've heard this band, it's the best thing I've ever heard, you've got to check them out, boom, 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 boom. So I've got a few friends like that, but you're one particular that's got a bit of you've got a big music head on you. You're always looking out for new music. You're always sending friends great stuff to listen to. And obviously you've got the politics. I mean, do you think that's fair sort of assumption of you?
Yeah, I love music. I've loved music ever since I was at school. I was very lucky that we had a lot of music at school, not only learning to play musical instruments, but growing up in the 80s and 90s in Glasgow, the west of Scotland, a lot of really good bands and just music everywhere. And sort of, there's times in my life I look at, and I think this particular artist got me through some hard times. And yeah, I think it's wonderful. I think it's the most natural form of art you can get.
Cool. So you haven't written the book. You haven't read the book. Read. You haven't read the book, but you've obviously got an idea about it. You've listened to the interview with Toby. So give us some feedback. What did you think about what we talked about? What was the first thing that kind of came to your mind?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I thought it's really good that this type of book is being written. I really enjoy this kind of analysis. It kind of got me thinking again about the writings of the late great Mark Fisher, who was a prolific Marxist thinker, visionary, who saw the importance of popular culture, and had a lot to say about it. And I think it's important. It's important discussions to be had, because I do feel that nowadays we're kind of moving towards kind of consuming music without kind of thinking too much about it. Although that's a generalization.
Right,
I think
yeah.
that there are movements from below, and there are sort of pockets. But we are competing with a lot of other sort of forms and social media and etc. Nowadays. But I think any attempt to sort of bring politics into music culture, music history, is very important, because I think that it's a natural human basic need of ours, I think, to sort of have music around, or play music or listen to music. But I think the capitalist class also understand that as well. And I thought it was very interesting about what Toby was saying about sort of the sort of development of modern pop music from the 1950s onwards, and kind of how there was a bit of a break, sort of in the 1980s, kind of in line with neoliberalism. And I think these things are really worth sort of scrutinising and
Yeah,
analysing.
I mean, I think
choice.
I overplayed it in the interview, the hinge of Human League, but this sort of 80s change of what he called new Fordism, which was interesting for me, made me think a lot about that. And then sort of this 80s period, which I'm from, very much so. I'm a little bit older than you, I think. And then the neoliberalist age, which we're in still. Some might argue that elements of it are changing, but the truth is these are two halves of this popular music era. And yeah, it was definitely it was fascinating. What did you make of the new Fordism sort of approach to understanding popular music?
I thought that it's quite interesting what he was saying about how, well, yes, Henry Ford was a fascist essentially, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure I would kind of view it just as that. They wanted to ward off revolution, and they were sort of. I think they were spooked out about kind of the sort of influence of black music at that time. My limited knowledge would say that Ford went a bit further than just sort of trying to influence the model of capitalism, because at that time, in particular, there was a kind of around the sort of Henry Ford factory. There was the Henry Ford School, which was developed, and it was particularly aimed at children, first of all, I think, and then it was extended to the workers there. And it was really a group of kind of industrialist capitalists who were really worried about the influence, particularly of jazz music in Detroit at that time, and how they saw it as morally repugnant. But they also saw how you can use culture as a way to influence society. So
okay,
they
like
set up
as a weapon kind of thing, you mean?
Yeah. So they set up these sort of schools and initiatives, and they actually provided incentives for the workforce to say, like, if you join one of it, I think they had like dance hall sort of societies where they were it was a counterweight to particularly jazz and the influence of black music, to sort of a kind of more sort of moralistically pure, in their eyes, obviously, form of music. And that they tried to, you know, it had a massive influence. And again, you know, a lot of the black music was kind of then more underground. That's where the development of the speakeasy clubs started to spring up. And the workers themselves, so, you know, Ford would say to them, you know, we'll give you a bonus on your paycheck if you join one of our societies. And with the intention of, you know, proper dancing, where you're, you know, doing this rigid sort of, I mean, that's my limited knowledge. But I think it would be worth exploring further.
Yeah, no, I might definitely do some other podcast going into it, because when I read the book, I hadn't really understood Marxist history, let's put it that way, from a Fordist perspective. And we qualified it a bit in the interview. And, you know, he talked about social democracy, this idea of capitalism putting in money to try and stave off revolution, which is what you said. But actually to better the workers was a good idea to keep them under control. You know, it was interesting for me because my sort of understanding of Fordism was the factory production line, the rapid production of materials. So, you know, even robotic car factories now, their historical birthright, I guess, is in Fordism, you know, where the factory line comes along and a worker puts on a door and he puts on doors all day long, and it churns out products really quickly. Now, I don't think we went into it too much directly in this way in the chat with Toby, but isn't that what music sometimes is like? Particularly, I went on about, well, I don't actually like pop music. What do you mean by pop music? And he explained it very well. But for me, the churned out crap that comes, which is a copy of the last thing because the last thing sold, like a sequel to a movie, is a bit Fordist production line.
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, there's some, I've read some theories as well about when the sort of music frequency changed from, now I might be wrong on this, 80 hertz to 60 hertz, that they actually found out that people worked harder, so there's more production going on. And you know, so again, that would have been a component. But I think, like, obviously, you know, capitalists will look at the model of Fordism and, you know, capitalism's good. They steal, they appropriate, don't they? So I think that kind of when we're looking at development of popular music, I mean, I'm a massive Beatles fan. I think the Beatles are the best band that ever roamed the planet, and I'm really obsessed with them. But again,
do you go screaming when you see them?
Well, obviously, I wasn't around
with
but even they started, you know, there was even you had sort of you know, the competing elements there, like, you know, like the Monkeys or whatever, you know, or the different sort of pop bands. And then I think what was interesting is during, you know, so I think there's always been obviously the influence of the record companies wanting to not only, I would say, you know, look at music production in terms of profit, but also as well kind of like what kind of messages they can get out. How can they influence? How can they influence popular culture as well? And I think we kind of saw with obviously the rise in neoliberalism in the 1980s. You know, I don't know who remembers. You know, we had outfits like Stock Aitken and Waterman who were quite prominent. Yeah, they were quite prominent in the 80s, weren't they? And, you know, had, you know, these sort of so-called pop stars had songs written for them, and they were kind of catchy, kind of, you know, and I think kind of designed to get people kind of addicted to that kind of chewing gum sort of pop music. And then kind of following on from that, you know, we saw, you know, after kind of like the Manchester rave scene, which was brilliant, we kind of then saw Britpop and sort of, you know, unfortunately they're back, but you know, we've got bands like Oasis, who quite frankly I think are, you know, the most overrated band that ever roamed the planet. But you know, there's probably a reason why they're back, and there's probably a reason why they're given so much sort of media space. And you know, and then you know, we see people like, you know, Taylor Swift, who's going to, you know, effectively influence the US election by, you know, so it's an interesting one in terms of kind of like, on the one hand it's fine to kind of like a song because it's catchy, and you know, but kind of know what it is that you're getting yourself into, really.
Yeah, this
because,
evolution,
you know,
this sort of neoliberalist evolution from sort of I know, Stock Aitken and Walkman, Rick Astley types with catchy tunes, up to X Factor bullshit.
yeah,
Up to complete pure manufacturing of music, and then the conflicts in that, because you dropped in there, oh yeah, the Manchester rave scene, you know. So I think the book and the interview was very much, there is a class struggle going on in music, although it doesn't represent itself as exactly the same as the class struggle on the street, but it's interrelated with this. And just on Taylor Swift, you see, because I mean, I think she's she's very pop artist of the, not of the popular music, but of the genre. And I've completely ignored her until I recently had
me too.
until I recently had a student who was mental on her. And I was trying to teach her English, a student. And so I found out about Taylor Swift, and she was like into it. And actually, I got a little bit more now. I think not the tunes, when I see her not performing on the grand, if you like, sparkly stage, the salesman one, when you see her just with a guitar singing, she's actually really good. You know, so if I saw her in the local pub, I would think, oh yeah, really nice. But the problem is the evolution of somebody with some talent to the superstar, to the influencer,
right.
to, as you were saying, the social media kind of model. The influencer is the word, I think, isn't it? You know, that they sell things, and actually they creep into politics from a right-ish perspective. And what are we doing on the left with that? How's that manifesting for us?
Well, that's a good question, Rob. Not much. I mean, there are kind of some, you know, we wouldn't want to write everything off, but you know, there are some kind of interesting movements that are developing. One band in particular I would give a shout out to is the Menstrual Cramps, who are a feminist punk band from Bristol. Who are, you know, one of the best bands live, I would say, at the moment. That's just my biased opinion. And they are touring at the moment. I would suggest if anybody gets a chance to see them, go and see them. But what's great about them is that they're also involved locally in terms of building sort of mutual aid and collective organisations where they're supporting other young artists down there. And you know, there's the question of, you know, artists' wages, and there's the questions of exploitation. But again, you know, where are the spaces? Where are the spaces for young artists to have the freedom to be able to you know, have the time or have the resources if they're not working, to be able to come together and jam off each other and get that creative spirit. And so you know, those sort of types of movements are quite interesting because they are campaigning at the against some of the big music festivals like Latitude, who were being sponsored by Barclays. So they had a huge campaign they were involved in, and they managed to, obviously, are bankrolling the Israeli regime, and they've managed to get, you know, Latitude to drop their Barclays sponsorship of Latitude. But we were talking to them when we were at Boomtown this year. I was at Boomtown this year as part of the Real News Activist Collective, and we had some debates and discussions, and actually most of the artists who play at these music festivals are not being paid, and so they're seeing it as an opportunity. But the question is at what point do you start to push back on that? Because on the other side of it as well, we're seeing massive ticket prices for bands, which is quite unaffordable for many people.
I think Paul
I'm
Heaton has come out recently from the Beautiful South in all the Oasis bullshit discussions that have been going on, which I purposely have
love Paul Heaton.
Very little about, we haven't gone into, but ticket prices. And I think you've hit something really important here, because I think one of the things that Toby was very good at the end, he's very positive, that they can crush us, they can repackage us, they can do all these things, but music, I think he uses it stuck in my head, this idea of volcanoes erupting, that the spontaneity of creativity within humans and within the class struggle will always come bouncing back. And you mentioned this band, he mentioned a band as well, and they're out there. But I think you hit on a really crucial thing which connects you and him together, in your trade union past, is the fact that we have to fight for that to be born. Not that we have to create it, not that you and me are going to go be the left-wing Stock Aitken in Wortman and I hear some left-wing bands that we're going to build. No, we have to create the spaces. So the idea of pay to play has to be crushed. We have to have the venues, that got crushed in particularly in the 90s and beyond, where there's nowhere for bands to play. It's reborn, being born a bit, but this kind of actual trade union based struggle of payment, spaces, that kind of thing, we need to fight for that. And if we do that, then we're going to get more of the music in our support, and therefore, if you like, the propaganda of the fight and the struggle against capitalism is going to be strengthened. I kind of, that's what I was reading from where you were
going. And I think also we've got to fight for those we've got to fight to politicize those organizations as well. The trade union movement at the moment is very apolitical in general. There's some fantastic trade unionists out there, some fantastic action that's taking place. But if you look at the trade union congress that took place a couple of weeks ago, a new deal for workers, the Keir Starmer, and the fact is that they're all clapping politely.
Even if he came on like Bill Clinton with the saxophone, it still would be load of shit, basically.
He's pushing pensioners into poverty and children as well, and he supports the genocide in Palestine. So the fact is that they're all politely standing up and giving him a standing ovation. It's absolutely disgusting, and it's actually, one of the other sort of things that I'm involved in as well is the Me Too campaign, where we've kind of been exposing how kind of toxic the trade union internal culture is, in terms of if you're a woman, if you're Black, if you're different, if you're basically someone who's got different politics or a different kind of outlook to the kind of ruling
bureaucratic machine,
then you are ostracized and you are kind of you're driven out. So we're pushing back against that. And I would also say as well, again, a general thing about the left in general. I mean, the question would be, what is the left nowadays? But again, you and I have kind of been in some of the more sort of revolutionary left-wing sort of organisations around their orbits as well, and I just find as well that kind of they view it as, oh, let's look back and see what Trotsky had to say about it, and which is all very interesting and all that, but it's academic and it's not really sort of given music culture its current place and not recognising the importance. So my view is that we kind of have to have a bit of a revolution within the left, if you see what I mean, so that we see kind of more radical voices coming through, and that type of thing that can kind of
I
shake
think
it up a bit.
We're running out of oxygen in the space station. That's the problem up here. It only lasts so long. I think that wraps it up really quite nicely, because let's call it the volcanoes of music, the volcanoes in the left. I think that the book is quite balanced in how it deals with those different theoretical questions. We started talking about the Frankfurt School. We didn't really go there, but it's quoted quite a lot. There's quite a lot there to go down. And I think there's going to be some other podcasts where I'm going to go down those lines much more firmly, because we need to get to this point where the left in general, not one particular section of it, needs, particularly as this book is based on the US and English, on the English language stuff, needs to get our shit together on understanding culture and changing society, because I think in Latin countries in general it's much more understood in my experience. Anyway,
well, I mean, just on that, sorry,
one last thing then before
Toby,
we're running out. Tick, 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 tick.
Yeah, Toby did make a good point about how it's always the margins, isn't it? And it's, you know, quite often it's sort of black queer music that's kind of, so we need to find mechanisms in terms of how we sort of bring that into the movement and shake it up and get rid of the deadwood, I would say.
Sounds good to me. Okay, well, look, take care traveling back down to Earth, and I will see you very soon. Okay, bye for now, Tracy.
Rob.
Cheers, bye.
Bye.
Outa-space Podcast would like to thank you for traveling with us today. We hope you have a pleasant onward journey. Please remember to take all your belongings.